Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Dr. Michael Erdman. I'm the curator of Turkish and Turkic Collections at the British Library. And it's my pleasure to be here today in order to talk to you about the Mir Ali Sher Navoi holdings at the British Library and to provide you with a bit of an overview of them and the research that we're doing. Today, I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the Eastern Turkic manuscripts at the British Library, what they contain, how they fit into the broader collections. Then I'm going to look at some of the Navoi manuscripts, a smaller part of that, and finally go on to a bit of the life and times of Navoi, so the manuscripts from Navoi's actual lifetime, before changing tack to look at a particular manuscript that I think is especially beautiful, followed by how you at home, outside of the United Kingdom, inside of the United Kingdom, can access these manuscripts from the comfort of your home without having to come to the library, especially during the lockdown or during the pandemic. And I'll end the sort of broader part of the presentation with a look at some of the continued work that we're doing, what still needs to be done and what sort of work we're doing to make sure that this is an easier collection to access, before providing you with a few different ways to keep up to date with the Mir Ali Sher Navoi manuscripts, our collections, and the work of the library and its curators as a whole. So the British Library, as perhaps you know, is the National Library of the United Kingdom. It's located in central London by St. Pancras. For those of you who are Harry Potter fans, it's quite close to the 9 3/4 platform. And the library holds over 170 million items, of which only about 150 items are manuscripts in Chagatai and other Eastern Turkic languages. The majority of these are in Chagatai, the language that was made famous and for which Navoi created a sort of a standard in the 15th century. But a number of others are also in earlier versions of Uyghur, of Tatar, of Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and other Turkic languages spoken across Central Asia, Iran, Northern India, Eastern Turkestan, and Siberia. These touch on poetry, history, politics, and administration. So I have here, for example, on the left of your screen, a Chagatai version of the Vaqiyat-i Baburi, or the Baburname, the memoirs of the first Mughal emperor, Babur. But some of them, others are other aspects of history of Central Asia and contain beautiful illumination or illustration. So here on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the Nusratname, a history of Chinggis Khan and his descendants, the Shaybanids, from about the 15th century, which exemplifies the heights of illustration, of painting and figurative representation in Central Asia during this period. So it contains quite a few beautiful images. And for those of you who can't come to London, it actually happens to be available online. Within these 150 items, approximately 40 are manuscripts relating to Navoi's work. That means they're poetry, usually poetry, and they might also be prose by Navoi or perhaps selections by another author of his poetry and prose. The majority of these poems, as you would expect, are in Chagatai, given that this is the language Navoi made famous. But we do have a few others in Persian and a small number in Ottoman Turkish. So on the far right-hand side of the screen, you see an example of a 16th century Khamsai Navoi, a collection of the cycle of 5 poems by Navoi from the 16th century, which is in Chagatai Turkic. But in the center, you can also see a 16th century rather, Persian translation as well from the Divan-i Fani, which contains some information to show you how Navoi's poetries were translated and transmitted to non-Turkic speakers across Eurasia and in the other literary language of Central Asia. These manuscripts span from the 15th century, so from Navoi's lifetime, right up to the 19th century, when Chagatai starts to fall out of usage as a literary vehicle in Central Asia. These earlier manuscripts, though I'm going to look a bit at the beginning of that time spectrum, 3 of them actually relate to the life of Navoi himself. So we have 3 different manuscripts within the British Library's collections, OR 401, 3493, and Ad MS 7914, which are from the time of Navoi's life, either just before his death in 1501 or just after his death in 1509. Some of these, such as the 2 on the far left, are from Herat. This is a Muntakhab Divan Navoi, so it's a selection of poems from his divan. It's not just beautiful calligraphy and beautiful poetry as well, obviously, but it's complemented by some stunning decoupage illumination, as well as gold floral illumination on the pages. And occasionally you do see, as on the far left, an illustration as well. It's not clear if these items, these additions were made after the poetry was actually copied. So these are not actually contemporary illustrations or illuminations, but it shows at least the way our manuscripts can demonstrate the high value of Navoi's poetry and the esteem with which his work was treated. Similarly, the far right, we have another item from 1482, which is actually from northern India. Again, some of Navoi's poetry that exemplifies the Gharaib exemplifies the way in which his poetry traveled from Herat and from Central Asia to other Turkic-speaking areas. And these are all very important, not only for an understanding of Navoi's life and times, but also an important component of showing the way in which his legacy evolved over time. So we can see what his poetry looked like and how it was copied when he was alive, and then compare it to some of those items I showed you earlier from the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to get an understanding of the evolution of Chagatai poetry. One particularly interesting example that I'd like to share with you is OR 1374, one of these later items from the 16th century from Yazd in contemporary Iran. It's a beautifully illustrated text. So we have quite stunning illumination. The far left, you have a sejade, or a carpet, a prayer rug motif, which shows you the use of gold and blue to adorn the opening of the khamsa. But then we also have what is the really spectacular part of this item, which is the lacquered binding, which shows a hunting scene. So it shows a prince out on the hunt with his courtesans and really shows the depth and the detail of painting and of decorative arts in Iran at this time. But it also gives you a hint as to how valuable this particular khamsa was seen, and indeed the broader work of Navoi's poetry. This beautiful lacquered binding is complemented on the interior by some illustrations as well, which are quite playful and fun. As you can see, they show the way in which illustration, illumination, and text were played out on a page, and how the artist might have subverted this use of the text box. You can see the arrow shooting up over the text box up to a part of the illustration that leaves the text. There's one last final aspect of this manuscript that's quite interesting, which is that there are a number of different parts of it that are covered in gold. So there's a shamsa, a sun out of gold, and a few gold blocks out of gold applied to the pages, which appear to block out the names of the owners. This sort of information is something that we have to recover through a variety of different new technologies, and it only will help us to understand how manuscripts such as these, how books such as these were traded across Eurasia, how information, knowledge, beauty, art was traded and spread from Central Asia through Iran, India, East Turkestan, Siberia, and how that was coveted by various different individuals across time and space. So now your appetite has been whetted for Navoi's poetry and some of his manuscripts. And don't fear, there are 6 items from the British Library that you can in fact access free of charge online. 4 of these, OR 3493, ADMS 7914, OR 401, and OR 13061 rather, are all available through bl.uk/manuscripts. They can be accessed just by typing in Navoi and then going through the searches. And as you can see on the far left, some of them show quite beautiful calligraphy. Others, such as on the far right, you have Gharab es-Sighar, which is from the Ottoman Empire. So it's actually a 16th century work showing the spread of Navoi's poetry to Turkey or to Anatolia. And this is an incomplete text. So the actual Gharab es-Sighar is not a full version of Gharab es-Sighar, but we do retain some of the more beautiful illuminations and illustrations that go along with the text, which have been digitized in full. In addition to these, 2 other items are available through the library's Archives and Manuscript catalog, and they're digitized through the Endangered Archive Program, which is a program administered by the library, whereby the library assists libraries and archives around the world with collections at risk to digitize and disseminate them. These happen to be 2 volumes of Navoi's poetry housed at the Karl von Richthofen Academic Library in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. And you can peruse these 19th century collections, codices, or here this divan, of his poetry again, free of charge online at the British Library, and be able to compare them with some of these earlier recensions of Navoi's works. So what's left to be done? Well, by and large, most of the manuscripts relating to Navoi's poetry have in fact been given at least skeletal records on our catalogue. So on the Archives and Manuscripts catalogue that you can find on the British Library's website. A few final manuscripts rather from the early printed catalogue in 1888 still need to be catalogued so that we have a whole corpus of the manuscripts available to search online. And then once that's done, what we need to do is actually link a lot of these texts. So I have here on the right-hand side a text, an example of a catalogue record for the Abushka, an Ottoman manuscript that is actually a dictionary of Chagatai Turkic, rather, in Ottoman Turkish, which relies heavily on Navoi's poetry to explain the meanings of the words. In order to really get a full sense of the networks of knowledge dissemination, knowledge sharing, and knowledge creation, relying on but not exclusively by Navoi, we really have to start beginning to create these webs of connections within our catalogues and with the actual works, so that researchers such as you and interested individuals such as you can easily find them and understand through your own lens how Navoi's poetry influenced the literary and scientific communities throughout Eurasia from the 15th century onwards. So I provided you with quite a lot of information now, and don't fear there's an easy way to be able to ask questions or to find out a bit more. You can always get in touch with me by email through michael.erdman@bl.uk, or you can visit our blog. So the British Library Asian and African blogs do contain a number of different articles about Navoi's poetry for you to peruse, as well as my own personal blog site, altaytuyukur.home.blog, with a bit more context about what we have. And please do follow us on Twitter at altaytuyukur, as I routinely will update individuals as new manuscripts are catalogued, photographed, and possibly digitized, so that you can keep up to date with the freshest information about how you can get your fix of Navoi right from home. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's proceedings.